All right, we are about to get started. Give me 1 second while I press go on this. Perfect. All right, hello and welcome to HTTP's Connected Communities virtual briefing series. This digital forum is dedicated to exploring the intersection of ethics, technology, and public policy by engaging scholars, community thought leaders, and policymakers from diverse backgrounds to give greater context to the lived reality of Black and Brown communities in our increasingly digital world. My name is Alejandro Rourke, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HTTP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a nationwide voice for Latinos in tech and telecommunications policy, HTTP member organizations support the social, political, and economic advancement of over 50 million Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Now, before we begin today, I want to invite our friends who are tuning in live on our website to join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag #HomeworkGap. I'll be checking in on Twitter throughout our dialogue today and have set aside some time towards the end so that our panelists can answer some of your questions. Our conversation today centers the experience of Black and Latino students and explores how the lack of at-home broadband connection is compounding pre-existing structural vulnerabilities, expanding digital inequality, and widening the racial achievement gap as schools move to both in-person and remote learning. Today, we are honored to be joined by FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, as well as thought leaders, school administrators, and members of HTTP's CEO Roundtable, including Brent Wilkes from Hispanic Federation, Amina from Common Sense, Amanda Fernandez, CEO and co-founder of Latinos for Education, Clint Odom from the National Urban League, Jennifer Meyer-Glenn from University Neighborhood Partners, and Tom Koch, Director of Future Ed. So thank you all for being here with us today. And today we're really going to begin our dialogue with a fireside chat with FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. So she served on the FCC Commission since 2012, and during her term, she has been a strong advocate for both gender equality in tech and telecommunications policy, and a proponent of policies that expand digital connectivity, and has long raised concerns about what we now know as the homework gap. So Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you again for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited you're at the helm of this organization, and I really appreciate being able to be here today and talk about digital equity, the homework gap, and how it affects the Latino community.
Wonderful. So, at HTTP, we engage a broad intersectional base of Latinos that tune into our digital briefing series. So for those tuning in that might not be familiar with the work of the FCC or your role as a commissioner, do you mind sharing some context about your work on the commission and perhaps maybe a little bit of your path towards becoming a commissioner?
Sure. The Federal Communications Commission has been around since 1934, which by Washington measure is really quite a long time. And technology has changed a lot since then. There are 5 members of the commission, 3 from the president's party and 2 others. I'm one of those other 2. And what's important to know is that in this role, we kind of have a front row seat at the digital revolution because the agency has authority over all kinds of internet connectivity, broadband, broadcasting, radio, new satellite services, pretty much any kind of communication. And so every day we wrestle with how do we get these new innovations available? And then I think what's important is we make we put time and energy into figuring out how we make sure those innovations reach all. And that includes urban America and rural America. It includes high-income households and low-income households. And I think really we don't see the full potential of innovation and communications unless we make sure these services reach everyone everywhere. So that's a little bit about the FCC. As for me, I have, this is my second tour of duty on the agency. I first came to it in the Obama administration. I left, and then I've come back in the minority during the Trump administration. Before that, I worked on Capitol Hill on legislation involving the digital television transition and the development of a network for communication for our first responders and a whole bunch of other things. And before that, I was in private practice, and I got started as a lawyer actually working on the privatization of the Puerto Rico telephone company. So I've been around these issues for a long time. And I'm still fascinated by them. And I still think we have a lot of work to do to make sure these technologies reach everyone everywhere.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your experience. So, I mean, during your term on the FCC, you really have worked to shine a light on the difficulty that students experience completing homework when they lack internet access at home, compared to those who may already have access at home. And you describe that as a homework gap. Do you want to kind of help us kind of understand why this specific issue kind of rose to be one of your top priorities?
Yeah, I think that we have this habit in Washington of talking about things in the most technocratic way possible. So, I mean, I could talk about the digital divide and speak to you about crowding in the 2.4 gigahertz band and what that means for unlicensed spectrum and what that means for access to the internet. But I think it's really important to talk about this in terms everyone understands. And I spent a lot of time with schools in this country speaking with them about whether or not they had adequate internet access in their classrooms. And no matter where I went, in rural towns, in big cities, I heard the same thing from educators. They said, we can bring all this new technology into our school because we have these connections, but we send our kids home at night and we can't be certain that those households have affordable internet access on a continuous basis. And I started thinking about that element of the digital divide because when I was growing up, if I wanted to do homework, I just needed paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. That was it. But those days are gone. 7 in 10 teachers assign homework now that requires internet access. But all the FCC data show that 1 in 3 households don't have broadband. And where those numbers overlap is what I started calling the homework gap. And before this pandemic, the Senate Joint Economic Committee said there were 12 million kids in this country who fall into this homework gap, who don't have internet at home and can't do their nightly schoolwork. And you'd see them sometimes in a McDonald's, doing their homework with a side of fries late at night or hanging out in the library parking lot just to catch a free Wi-Fi signal. But here we are now in this crisis. So many students have been told to go to school online. And those kids that fall into the homework gap, it's like they're locked out of the virtual classroom. And that homework gap is becoming an education gap, which is becoming an achievement gap. And recently some work was done by Common Sense Media and the Alliance for Excellence in Education, and they found that as many as 17 million students now fall into the homework gap. But it's not just nightly schoolwork, it's now all of class during this crisis. And what we're doing is especially cruel for students who don't have that access right now. They are falling behind, and 25% of Latino students right now are among those who fall into the homework gap and have difficulty going to online class. It just seems to me that this is a national crisis, but it's not so unwieldy and big that we can't focus our energies and come up with tools and programs to solve it, fix it, and close it. And that's what I'd like to see the FCC do.
100%. So, I mean, speaking of the FCC, you guys have diverse tools at your disposal, like the Lifeline program that provides low-cost broadband connectivity to low-resource families, and the Schools and Libraries Universal Service Support Program, known as E-rate, that helps schools obtain affordable broadband and extend broadband access to those most in need. So for those of us watching that may be hearing about these programs for the first time, could you describe how these programs are administered and how any of that has changed during this time of COVID?
Yeah, so there's 2 primary programs that can help, I think, right now. And candidly, they're being underutilized. I'd like the FCC to rise up and meet this moment and do more with them. The first is Lifeline. Lifeline's a program that's been around since 1985 when Ronald Reagan was in the White House. And most communications involved like a curly cord you plugged into the wall. It's a long time ago. But back then, there was this conviction that every household needed phone service. If you didn't have phone service, how did you call for emergency help? How did you manage healthcare, school, keep a job, find a job? That was considered basic. Now, the Lifeline program still exists today, and it's evolved over time. It includes wireless phones now, and it includes some data. And that's important because, candidly, in the modern world, dial tone is now internet access. There are about 7 million folks, a little more than 7 million across the country that use the Lifeline program. And what it does is it provides support so that low-income households can get a little boost so they can continue to stay connected, even if they've lost a job or having a hard time paying their bills. So Lifeline's really important to just make sure everyone can stay a little bit connected. Now, as I look around in this crisis and I see cars and lines and food banks, and I see a world where we've been asked to go online for everything, for school, for work, for education and healthcare and more, I'd really like the agency to revitalize the Lifeline program and frankly make it more responsive to the moment we're in. The agency has made some small changes to reduce some of the paperwork for recertification and re-verification and qualification for it, which is generally based on if you have a household income of about 135% of the nation's poverty line, or if you participate in certain programs associated with that. So I'd like us to see us think more boldly about it, because I think households have been asked to do so much online right now. We need to make sure, even if there's job loss, every household stays connected. And the second program we talk a lot about, and I talk a lot about, is called E-Rate. E-Rate's the nation's largest education technology program. And maybe you've never heard of it, but it's been around since 1996 when Congress made the law of the land. And it is a program that supports internet connections in every school, in every state, in schools in every state across the country. It's really important. It helps schools in rural America connect. It helps schools in urban America connect. And more support's available for schools that have higher percentages of students on free and reduced lunch plans. It just makes sure that every school has the digital education potential that every other school could have. That's really valuable. But now we're in this crisis where class is no longer the classroom. For many students, my own included, class is the kitchen table, right? Because they've been asked to go to class online. And it seems to me that we should be able to take the E-Rate program and again, update it to meet this moment, because we could use that program to support initiatives like having every school library loan out wireless hotspots. If they did that, the kids who don't have connectivity at home would instantly have a way to connect, which means they could go to class and keep up with school, and they'd get out of that homework gap that I think is becoming a really big problem in so many of our communities.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, completely agree. I think the Lifeline program, especially in this time, really is a lifeline to American families. And I think that what we have all seen is that it is underutilized, and there is kind of like that gap of awareness that these programs are available and that they're readily accessible and ready for communities and families to take advantage of them. So, I've been in preparation for today, and also I think kind of just to getting to know you a little bit, I've been binging a lot of your kind of Broadband Conversations podcast, which everybody should check out. It is a great, thoughtful conversation that really is meant to kind of raise the leadership of women in tech and telecommunications partnership, and I think that the very first episode that you had with Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, you really said something, and I think she said something at the very, very end which has kind of stuck with me. And that's this idea that the future of the internet is the future of opportunity in this country, right? And I think that I definitely agree, and I think that our members and the people on the panel today would agree. But I think in this time of kind of like unprecedented crisis, what do you think that Congress can do, right, to help strengthen both the E-Rate program and provide maybe a clear understanding about the intention of the statute of the program, and maybe what are some of the the new solutions that we really haven't explored that could be implemented either FCC or through an act of Congress?
Yeah, it's so important. So glad you mentioned that. The podcast. I'm the only woman serving at the FCC right now. And at some point I got so tired of appearing on these panels where they talk about diversity and the STEM pipeline and they clutch their pearls and say, oh no, what are we going to do? And I just decided I was going to amplify the voices of women doing things in technology. And Senator Cortez Masto grew up with the Consumer Electronics Show in her backyard. She was talking about drone use and experimentation in the Nevada desert. And it's extraordinary when you start talking to people and realizing there are so many women and so many more people doing things in technology than I think media would suggest. So I'm really proud that we have a whole bunch of people on there talking about those things. And it was a treat to start this initiative with her. Now, you asked about Congress and what they can do. What I think is really neat is both the Lifeline program and E-rate program I mentioned have been given a boost by Congress in the HEROES Act, which is the next package for coronavirus stimulus that has passed the House of Representatives. The E-rate program, there's a bill in there that Congresswoman Grace Meng developed from Queens, New York, that would boost E-rate by making sure the FCC does the kind of things I described, which is use the E-rate program to help loan out wireless hotspots and come up with other solutions to connect kids. That's really great. There's a Senate companion bill. I do hope it becomes the law of the land. Though I'd point out that the FCC could do this right now. I don't think we should wait. I think these are crisis moments. We can do audacious things. I'd like to be relentless and pester my colleagues on that point. The bill also increases some support for Lifeline and expands the program so more households can stay connected. And if they lose a job, for instance, they can ensure that their household can stay online, look for new opportunities, keep up with healthcare, and continue with education. So both of those programs would get a boost in some legislation that's pending before Congress, and I hope that does come to pass.
Yeah, completely agreed. Well, Commissioner, I know that you have another engagement today and you need to hop off, but I want to thank you so much for your time and your attention today and for your service on the FCC. And I encourage everybody to check out Broadband Conversations that are dedicated to amplifying the voices of women who are making a difference in our digital lives. You won't regret it. It's the new podcast I listen to every time I go for a walk. Thank you for that. And thank you again for your service.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. You've got a totally dynamic group of people following, and appreciate the work you do.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Take care.
So now I would like to formally kind of welcome our panel, beginning with the CEO and co-founder of Latinos for Education, Amanda Fernandez. So Amanda, you have been a lifelong advocate breaking down barriers to educational opportunities for Latino students. And in your role leading Latinos for Education, you have witnessed firsthand how COVID has exacerbated existing social inequalities and put many students and parents under the risk of emotional and academic harm as students, abruptly transitioned to remote learning last spring. And now many families and students fear that going back to school this fall would expose them to the virus, especially families most disadvantaged by virtual learning, which are families from low income, multi-generational households, which are, as we know, at greatest risk of death or serious illness from the coronavirus. Could you share with us some of the vulnerabilities that Latino families and students are facing, and how you think that schools can prepare our education infrastructure, both today and for a potential second wave of the virus?
Sure. Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for having me on today. Just first, a quick sentence or two about Latinos for Education. We're the first Latino founded and led national organization dedicated to creating leadership pathways for emerging Latino leaders in the education sector, as well as diversifying education nonprofit boards. So we are primarily focused on leadership pipeline and representation in education by Latinos, given that 1 in 4 of our students right now are Latino, and in the next few years will be 1 in 3. So we think representation really matters. But then COVID hit, and we felt like we had to respond to the moment ourselves as an organization, to dig a bit deeper and to, frankly, also expand how we think about our work and what's important right now. And what we initially started out with was talking to our teachers, Latino educators who carry the extra tax of being a Latino educator, and some of the things that they were experiencing with being the sole person in their school building or one of the few Latinos in their district who played the role of following up with families, making phone calls, and going above and beyond during this crisis to make sure that Latino families, especially Spanish-speaking families, were getting support and that the schools were reaching out to them. So our teachers themselves not only were initially worrying and following up with their families and students, but also themselves. Many of our Latino educators are first generation, and they themselves have had many challenges in their own families in dealing with the COVID crisis. Many are the first and the main breadwinner and supporting families extensively. So I think while we look at the challenge on our students and families, we also can't forget that our teachers themselves are facing, Latino teachers in particular, facing a multitude of challenges. And so it does go both ways. The commissioner laid out some pretty interesting data on 17 million without possible broadband and technology access, 25% of those being Latinos, and make the connection to that 25% with 1 in 4 of our students being Latino. So it's as we know, affected our community in such significant ways. So when we went about thinking, what do we do to expand our work? We wanted to make sure that the decisions that were being made, especially in our geographies of Massachusetts and the Houston area, where we have specific sites, that we were wanting to hear directly from families. We were concerned that decision-making at the state level, in particular at the federal level and at the district level, would be made, decisions would be made without the voices of our families being at the forefront, even though, again, we know Latino families have been the most impacted. So we went about a survey process. We identified through hundreds of survey respondents that yes, mental health was one of the key challenges that our families in particular identified as a top concern for their students. And along with that, they did cite that one of their major concerns was also text access and support. We know that in many districts during this past school year, upwards of 20% of students were not logging in. We think that there were multiple reasons for that. As the commissioner cited, lack of access to technology, too often one computer for multiple children, and families having to make the devastating choice about who gets the computer at what point in time to do their work. So this has really highlighted for us that our families, Latino families, have every right to be concerned about going back into a classroom. They are terrified. When you're hardest hit, you're terrified about what the consequences may be about you sending your child to a classroom. So therefore, for us as Latinos for Education, what has risen to the top for us as we think about our advocacy work, it absolutely has to be on closing this digital divide. We all know that the gap was already there. Latino students were affected by lack of access to educational opportunity. And now this issue has exacerbated the problem. And so we think that technology access is one of the best ways that we can make sure that our families, every family has broadband access and that they have a device or enough devices for their students. We've seen significant dollars being allocated to devices and broadband and hotspots. But one thing I'll cite is that we also have to consider that there's potential for redlining in many of our cities. you can draw a line around various low-income communities that are not getting broadband access. They either have no broadband or they have a very poor access. So these are things we also have to highlight, in particular as advocacy organizations, that there are distinct issues happening that are preventing families from accessing the technology that they need. So just to close out, I know we have to give the rest of the panel an opportunity to chat here. We are very much aligned with the work that you all are doing. We believe in the focus on digital citizenship for all students. We think that, again, both at the federal level, more needs to happen. Some of the programs that were already outlined, this is an issue of communication. We find this at all levels in the system, that Latino families and other families whose first language is not English, there's a huge disparity in the amount of information that they get. So that in and of itself would be a very helpful way to get information out to our families, is to get it out at the same time and at the same level of information that English speaking families get. So that'll be the one thing that I will say, that at a sort of all levels, at local, state, and federal, just start there.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And you raise a very, I think, important concern that right now, many kind of like low resource families or families without, internet connection are making that choice of whether to send their children to school or not, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when there isn't an at-home broadband connection, that decision becomes whether do I keep my family and my children safe at home and forego any type of educational instruction, which again kind of puts students back, or our goal is to ensure that the families are able to make, I think, a better choice, which is to also be able to engage with distance learning by having a broadband connection and devices at home. Absolutely. So Clint, I would love to kind of include your perspective, as your role as SVP for Policy and Advocacy for the National Urban League. You guys also commissioned an analysis using data from the 2018 American Community Survey, where you were able to really paint a clearer picture of the state of disconnection for households with school-age children under the age of 18. So do you mind sharing a little bit about what you learned as a result of that investigation and what you consider to be the essential elements to facilitate effective online learning?
Unmute, the magic of unmute. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I had the privilege of working with Commissioner Rosenworcel both at the FCC many years ago and then working for her at the FCC. And she's been a real champion for closing the homework gap. And I think when the record books and the history books are written, she'll prove to be one of the most influential people in helping devise policies to close this gap. Earlier this year, we did a study with our partners at UNIDOS, the Alliance for Excellent Education, and others, that examine really the state of the broadband gap that has been well documented and described. We've heard the statistic about 17 million children who lack high-speed home internet access necessary to support online learning, which means of a speed that allows two-way video without any interruption, without buffering. A less talked about statistic is the 7.3 million children who do not have a laptop, desktop, or tablet computer. For all of the advances that we've seen in handheld devices and so-called smartphones, the limitations of screen size and bandwidth really do not make these devices optimal for online learning. We've also heard the statistic, there are about 50 million public school kids in the country, K through 12, because the majority of those children are children of color. Whenever we talk about public school issues in this country, we are essentially talking about problems that children of color and families of color have to deal with. 1 in 3 Black, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native families do not have home internet access, do not have it at home. Let me just say at home. 1 in 3 families who earn less than $50,000 a year do not have high-speed internet at home. Urban areas are not unique in this. 2 in 5 families in rural areas do not have high-speed home internet. We just recently did a convening in Kansas City, which I think is a perfect place to talk about these issues because it is both urban and it is rural. It is just a stone's throw from Kansas, Kansas City, Kansas, and more rural parts of the country. And here's what we've learned. Poverty and internet access have a inverse relationship with each other. In other words, the poorer the community you live in, the less likely that you will have broadband. Whether or not it's the fiber run or a cable run is to your house or not, it's about affordability. In Kansas City, for instance, what we learned is that when the pandemic hit in March, 45% of the students in the Kansas public school system did not return to the classroom online. 45%. Let that sink in. One of the things that we have been talking about here lately in the wake of the murder of George Floyd is we've been talking about the need to have systemic reforms. The economy goes up and down. The stock market does the same. Yet these problems of internet access persist. Why do they persist? I believe it's for 2 reasons. 1, poverty, especially in communities of color. And 2, in rural areas, there's not enough money or investment capital to build the infrastructure to deliver it. So poor people, low middle income people in the inner city, and people who live in the rural areas have a real vested interest in trying to solve this problem. So we've been working with a lot of our partners to help solve the problem, but the solutions we've been talking about have been very incremental. Commissioner Rosenworcel talked today about really incremental changes to make a big difference. We think the biggest change that you can make, and this is something only Congress can do. The FCC can't do it under its current authority. Congress can't do it with its current appropriations level, is start to appropriate the kind of money that is necessary for low and middle income families to get online and to build infrastructure to rural parts of the country. This is a bold initiative. We need to do it, but this teetering around the edges with a funding formula for universal service that just can't support the number of people that are impoverished. Whatever the numbers were before the pandemic, with 30 million homes, food insecure, that number is going to be worse when we take a look at the beginning of next year. There are 3 million African Americans who in July lost their jobs. Whatever we think the unemployment rate is, it's probably below. Nearly 200,000 people, 177,000 people dead in the United States. About 77,000 of those are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Latino, Pacific Islander. These are stunning statistics, and these aren't things that we will come back from just by the market coming back. We're going to need some very specific and focused government expenditure in addition to some of the fine policy ideas that we've been discussing here, and I hope we continue talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, for helping us kind of paint that picture. I think that you're absolutely right when we think about, internet connectivity is not just, about education. It's also about, economic opportunity for Black and brown communities. It's about the ability to new skill and reskill our communities that may have lost their job during this economic crisis. It's about being able to apply for government assistance programs, safety net programs. All of that has moved online, and we know that I think access to broadband really is a core indicator that really help determine the health and well-being of our communities.
And Alejandro, as you know, there's a well-worn statistic that only 1 in 5 Black workers have the luxury of being able to work from home. One in six Latino. So we've got to be able to figure out how to continue our participation in this economy, and be safe while doing it. Yep.
So Amina, I want to include your voice because, working at Common Sense, you guys also kind of recently published a report, inside the 21st century classroom, right? And you really kind of dig into, I think, the thoughts, perceptions, and the feelings of educators nationwide. You guys compiled a lot of great first-person narratives about what teachers and students and families are experiencing. And I think that you also have some very clear insight. I know that you kind of delved into this idea of not just broadband access, but also access to devices so that students can connect online to conduct a lot of their online learning. So do you mind sharing with us kind of what you learned, as a part of your report, and what I think are some concerns that we need to be raising collectively to ensure that every student is able to continue their educational scholastic career?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So, we've been digging into the issue of the homework gap for a number of years now, and initially we were looking at it from the perspective of teachers. We thought that would sort of add a new, fresh set of eyes to the issue. And what we were finding was that even though teachers were in schools that were starting to get really well resourced in terms of connectivity, one-to-one devices, even professional development to be able to really utilize the software and equipment that was coming into the classroom, they would hesitate to really utilize it because they knew if their students went home, they wouldn't be able to access the internet. And so they just wouldn't really be able to have a fair and robust experience finishing their assignments or doing their homework. So what we were seeing is that there was this distortion that was rising up from the lack of access for the students at home and impacting even well-resourced schools. So we put all this effort in at the federal level, at the state level, to make sure schools had connectivity, devices, professional development, and that's being sort of eaten away because we're not actually closing the loop and making sure that students have access at home. And since the start of the pandemic, we've also talked to kids and asked them how that they've been feeling and what their concerns are. Their concerns have been, very much, similar to what adults are worried about. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their the economic health of their household, whether or not there'll be food or a roof over their head. And then, they say that they're not actually meeting with their teachers. They're not seeing their teachers. They're not connecting with their teachers, that it's difficult to do so. And again, these are students who we know are disadvantaged students that are from low resource homes. So, again, we're seeing that distortion of that homework gap, which is now a learning gap because of that lack of connection. And we most recently did a report that tried to really scope out what that full homework gap starts to look like for K through 12. We found very similar numbers. Around 16 million students are left in this gap. And that's a combination of connectivity, but also about devices. We were specifically asking, do you have enough connectivity to do distance learning? And to do distance learning, you have to do distance learning on something other than a cell phone. And in the first few months after the social distancing measures of the pandemic, we saw that students and parents were just sort of struggling to connect, so that parents were handing their phones over and kids were watching their classroom on a phone, which is really incredibly expensive, right? It's a lot of data to do that kind of synchronous learning on a phone. Also, it's a very small device that's not really useful for a learning environment. And not only do we have this connectivity issue, but we also have this device issue. That device issue is you need to have laptops, but you also have to have tablets. For younger students, a laptop's probably a little too much. For older students, you certainly need to have a laptop. And what we found in the course of doing a report after talking to ISPs, device manufacturers, state officials, state ed officials, schools. We learned that there is this huge supply chain issue with respect to laptops. And that even if schools assessed their need and determined how many devices they need and actually somehow secured the funding to be able to pay for all those devices, they just couldn't find them. They couldn't buy them. They just weren't available. And I think that, that's somewhere where we certainly need to have, a school alone is not going to be able to exert pressure on manufacturers to sort of change where they're prioritizing the sale of their devices. Some device manufacturers have prioritized the educational market, and so you see a lot of educators taking up those types of devices. But you've got to have more than just one device manufacturer, because we've got so many kids that are going to need these devices. And certainly anybody who's on this call, anybody that's watching this on a computer understands that, computers break down. And, we're going to need to not just have one-to-one devices, but when we're talking about school being online, that means schools need to make sure that they can keep up with any kind of fixes that they need to do, any breakdowns that occur. So that device piece is really a huge pain point for educators to try to acquire those devices. And I think the federal government and state governments could step in and try to help prioritize the educational market in this time of crisis, when students really do need to have their hands on these types of devices, and make sure that we prioritize them. Not just prioritize selling to this market, but then also like transparency with the prices to make sure that everybody understands what like a real price point looks like. There's no reason why a laptop in California should be a different price from a laptop in Georgia. It's still the same laptop built somewhere else, just being shipped to you. So it's, certainly, having some transparency would free up the ability of educators to really understand, what options they have on the table and how they should allocate their resources.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think you really bring up this clear point, that I try to imagine what it's like to be a parent working from home, right? To have school-age children that also now are kind of transitioning to online learning. I'm thinking like, well, what does this look like, right? Are we expecting our children to be in front of a computer all day for 8 hours, right? And if you have multiple children, are they sharing a device? How are you kind of scheduling that? How are you coordinating with educators about what time your student has in front of a device? And I think that you raised a really valid point about, do we even have enough devices within the market to actually fill our current kind of like educational needs? So with that, I really would love to turn it over to kind of Mr. Brent Wilkes, my former boss when I worked at LULAC with Brent. And I feel like Brent has been really a lifelong advocate for kind of like bridging the digital divide, and is always kind of like on the forefront of coming up with innovative solutions to ensure that those historically disconnected communities have some type of access to, I think, the transformative power of the internet. I think both at LULAC, you started the innovation hubs, and now as your role with Hispanic Federation, you rolled out a new initiative, which are kind of like the digital education hubs. And I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about, what this new program does and looks like, and how you're really kind of trying to fill in the specific gaps of like, if families don't have a computer, a device, connectivity at home, then they probably also don't have or need help developing the digital skills necessary to navigate the new online environment. So I know that this is what your digital education hubs are doing, and I'd love to kind of hear more about how that idea came about and where we can expect these across the country.
Thanks, Alejandro. It's great to be on with everyone. It's really been an incredible conversation so far, and definitely enjoyed Commissioner Rosenworcel's remarks. I think she's spot on about the need to really treat this as a crisis to make sure that we get more families online as soon as we possibly can. So we've got a wonderful project that we're rolling out. We've currently got 25 locations across the country where we're doing this. And the goal is to create these labs within nonprofit organizations that are Latino-led and Latino-based, serving the Latino community. That's really the mission of the Hispanic Federation. We work with Latino nonprofits, really try to help them build up their skill sets, provide funding for them, but also try to provide different toolkits and capacity building so that we can help them do what they're doing already, but do it better. And so one of the projects right now are these digital labs that we're setting up. And they're meant to serve both families as well as folks who are looking for work and providing that digital skilling opportunity. I think that another important statistic is the number of people that are unemployed in this country right now, especially Latinos and African Americans. And the fact that if they're out there looking for work, they're competing against a lot of other people, and it's important for them to have the skill sets that they need to be successful to be able to get those job opportunities. And hopefully, Clint, like you were mentioning, job opportunities you can do from your home as opposed to necessarily having, being on the front lines and being at risk of catching COVID-19. So that's a big part of the focus as well. But the labs are really dual purpose so that they can help both families and folks looking for work. And of course, as you mentioned, the theme for us was, we know that a lot of folks haven't adopted. I think Jessica Rosenworcel was mentioning it was about 1/3 of our communities that haven't adopted. And I think price is really the major component here, but there's also the issue of not necessarily being familiar with the technology and not necessarily understanding how important it can be for families. And so the labs were really designed to help communities get experience with using the equipment, learn how to connect to the internet. We do everything from very basic all the way up to coding. So there's quite a bit of different skill sets that they can pick up, but it's really meant to be an introduction. And the goal then is to encourage them to adopt broadband at home and to, begin to take these classes online as well. Since COVID-19 struck, we've basically had to move a lot of this work now virtually. And so we're teaching the classes online. And as a result, we're running into the same problems that we're identifying here, which is some families don't have broadband in their homes, and some families don't have the devices that they need to be able to take the courses. And so what we're looking at doing there is providing these lending libraries where people can come and check out devices, check out hotspots, and then we're trying to connect them up to the low-cost broadband programs that a lot of HCTP's partners are providing so that they can adopt and get access. So it's not ideal, because originally we wanted them to come in first to the labs to get the experience and then adopt. But since COVID-19's hit, we can't really bring them into the laboratories for the time being. And so we're really working to try to create these lending laboratories. So there's no investment by the families to start with, but we're hoping that once they get hooked and once they start taking the classes, they'll realize the benefit from that for themselves, both in terms of educational opportunity and workplace opportunities. And then we're hoping that they'll adopt and they'll be able to continue with courses with us, but hopefully utilizing their own equipment and their own broadband connectivity. So it's going really well. We're definitely I think impressed that we've been able to actually convert to doing this all online when initially it was supposed to be in person. We will be putting out a white paper to kind of discuss the success of what of the project in terms of being able to convert to this digital world. But it certainly is a challenging environment, and I wholeheartedly endorse all the panel's comments here that it's absolutely critical that we get broadband into the homes that don't have it, and to get these devices into the homes so that they can take these classes. I do want to mention one thing, because Jessica brought it up. I think that there's a problem with the way the Lifeline program is working now, because a lot of that is mobile-based broadband, and unfortunately, that typically ends up being one person in the family that gets that, and you can only have one device per family. And so I'm hoping that we can somehow encourage the wireline providers to start ramping up participation in the Lifeline program, because that's what we really need for a whole family. You've got to have a broadband connection for the whole family. You basically want a wireline connection with a wireless access point. And that's when we can start providing those devices that can connect up to that. And so that way all the kids can share one connection rather than passing around the cell phone, which just really isn't the best way to do this, if possible.
Right. And I think that you really kind of bring up a great point that's the, bridging the digital divide really is a team lift, and it requires both action from Congress, from regulators like the FCC. I think it takes community leadership to understand the needs of the community. And so I really wanted to kind of bring Jennifer Meyer-Glenn, who's the director of University Neighborhood Partners in Utah, to talk about her perspective. Jen, you've been an educator, you've been an administrator, you've been a vice principal, you've worked at the school district, so you really kind of experienced what it's like, for students, and what it's like to kind of develop policies to ensure that every student has access to a quality education. And so I'd love to kind of get your perspective about, as Utah or the Salt Lake City School District is working through how to best kind of get back to school. What does that process look like for you in a kind of a school district that is already, or I think, on the verge of being a minority majority school district?
Thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, let me give a tiny bit of context. So Salt Lake City, while we are Utah, and I know we appear very white on a map, we actually are quite a diverse city, like most larger, and I know we're not huge compared to other metropolitan areas. However, the Salt Lake City, like most urban areas, has a racial divide. Ours is our freeway and our train track. And on the west side of our city, we are definitely a large majority of people of color. The school where I was most recently an assistant principal, 90% students of color, 70% students coming from homes where a language other than English is spoken. My last role at the Salt Lake School District was a family school collaboration director, trying to find ways to bridge between the schools and families. And some of that work that we did, and I think this is one of the things that we can bring into this conversation, was that we did a landscape assessment with families. And what we learned from families is that, and as a lot of you I'm sure know, there's a lack of trust between families and institutions, educational institutions, our schools. And I think this is one of the things that has actually played into the digital divide. So beyond having access to devices, beyond having access to broadband, some of those kids who didn't show up, it's because they don't feel connected to school, because our schools are not culturally responsive, and kids and families are disconnected. And so that's one of the things we actually, now at my role as the director of University Neighborhood Partners, it's a department of the University of Utah located in the west side of Salt Lake. And we've been working together on a family school collaboration design research project where we've brought together administrators, teachers, parents to try to be able to unpack some of these issues that contribute to the digital divide. And so we recently did a Zoom interview video and heard from parents talking about some of the issues they're experiencing when it comes to the lack of devices and so on and so forth, but also just the lift that they've had to make in terms of how do you schedule home for a student who has access to which devices when. I do know the Salt Lake School District coming up now is a one-to-one school district in terms of devices, but then we're still facing the issue of access to broadband. There are definitely hotspots that people can access, but I see hotspots as a Band-Aid. And that one of the things that we really need to do if we're talking about making large policy change, that access to broadband should be as accessible as electricity and water. If we're going to be living like and not just COVID, I'm talking about the digital divide as it has been exposed more during COVID. But if we're, as we move in through the 21st century that we need to make sure that it's as accessible so that families can begin to understand the benefits of it and can begin to use it in a way that supports their students in their education. And then I also just want to give a shout out to teachers. I know so many teachers who are doing, as Amanda kind of talked about earlier, who are doing double duty right now, where they're figuring out how to do online classes as well as trying to reach out. We're working with some teachers right now who are actually planning on coming to our facility in the parking lot. We'll be putting up shade structures to provide some instruction to students because Salt Lake will not be going back to school. We'll only be having online school until the end of October, and then we'll see what happens there. So the west side of Salt Lake is a hotspot, and so the families on the west side of Salt Lake kind of demanded, no, we cannot open schools. It's too dangerous and scary for us right now. So that advocacy was pretty impressive. But yeah, I think beyond devices, beyond broadband, we still need to look at the issue of families feeling connected to school and feeling like school is being culturally and linguistically responsive to them.
Yeah, no, I super appreciate that. And I think that one of the things that I really admired about, growing up in Utah, specifically in Salt Lake City, is the process within which I think that we're very intentional about engaging diverse stakeholders. And I think that it's great that you guys have both convened, parents, right, as well as educators to really understand, how they feel about the potential of schools reopening, what kind of tools they might need to make that successful, and really kind of centering kind of policy decisions so that they are taking into account, I think, the people that are going to be most directly impacted. So thank you for your work. And I'd love to kind of now turn it over to Tom Koch, who's the director of Future Ed. So Future Ed is an independent, solution-oriented think tank at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, and they are committed to bringing a fresh energy to the causes of educational excellence, equity, and efficiency in K through 12 and higher education on behalf of the nation's most kind of disadvantaged students. So Tom, I'd love to kind of engage you to kind of, how are you guys kind of thinking through what reopening can and should look like, right? Or how do schools cope with the kind of the COVID landscape? And really, I think when we think about technology in the classroom, what really is the purpose, right? And how are we conducting online learning? And how are we kind of measuring the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alejandro. I think it's probably useful to in the few minutes we have to amplify Jennifer's important point about thinking of connectivity as more than just a physical digital relationship that provides a learning tool or learning tools, and think of it more broadly as helping students and their parents feel emotionally, psychologically connected to schooling and the schools in which schooling goes on. That's been a big, as we've heard from Amina and Jennifer, a big component of the disconnect, if you will, between many families of color and schools, and that's greatly heightened in the difficult racial environment that we find ourselves in nationally. And so while the lack of physical connectivity, as we've been talking about, the digital divide, the homework gap, are critical, I do think it's worth just thinking a little bit, very briefly, about how we might use technology important in useful ways to connect kids emotionally and psychologically. In other words, or I should say, one place to start perhaps is making sure that adult educators connect every day one-on-one to their students. Now that becomes much harder, if not impossible, if kids just don't have equipment at home. But But in fact, we really need to work around that as best we can, using lower tech strategies like telephones, even in order to make sure that kids feel that they are part of the schools in which and the classrooms in which they're supposed to be learning. I don't think we should expect students to sit in front of computers 6 hours a day if in fact they do have connectivity. I think less is more in this environment. We should focus on core subjects and try to build instructional opportunities where kids can work together on teams, maybe using Zoom and chat groups and the like, where they can connect with each other, working on projects. Again, important for many students to build a sense of identity and to socialize, which has been something we've really been missing since mid-March. That said, we should get as much synchronous instruction as possible to students for at least a portion of every day. Again, because face-to-face instruction is a key signaling device to students that they are seen and valued, that they're being heard, literally. I think advisories are a really important strategy that schools can use to have an adult, either if it's a teacher, fine, if it's a custodian or food service worker, that's fine too. Any adult associated with the school can be connecting with students every single day. And I think finally we can be more creative than we have been in deploying our teachers in ways that serve students and increase this level of emotional connectivities. For example, you can have the best third grade English teacher in the school district doing Zoom lessons for everybody, and then having the rest of the teachers who teach that subject at that grade level reaching out on one-on-one basis to their students for additional support and sort of emotional connections. That's just one quick example of the many ways that I think we can be much more creative to build greater connectivity, broadly defined, between schools and our disadvantaged populations of students who need that support now more than ever, for sure.
Yeah, I think that was such a great point, and I think that really COVID-19 is all kind of giving us the freeway to kind of reimagine the way that education is delivered, and I think that is such a great solution. Now that we can pre-record lectures and kind of blast them out to students, right? That might be just, let's get a teacher that's really comfortable doing that, and then deploying our other teachers to kind of really be doing that, checking in with the students, helping them with homework and other kind of classroom tasks, as opposed to each educator having kind of like a responsibility of kind of being with that student for however many hours a day that it is. So thank you so much for bringing that to the table. And for all of your resources that are available online, please check them out at futureed.com. And so, I think that we're just about at time. So I want to thank Commissioner Rosenworcel for a great conversation and for your work on the commission. And to our panelists for their insight today, please follow them all on social media and online. I will make sure to put all of their information in the video description below. So I'll include the report from Common Sense, the report from NUL. I'll include some great blog posts from Latinos from Education and from Future Ed as well. So please stay connected with them. And also please make sure to follow HCTP on our social channels. That's at HCTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of our Connected Communities digital briefing series. So until then, thank you all to our panelists for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time. And for everybody watching, please tune into the conversation, speak out, and stay connected because the future needs our help. Thank you. Have a good day.